In the ancient world, there are many wondrous people, places, and events. There are the Babylonians, the Persians, the empires of the Greeks and the Romans. But to the Christian, there is one event that strikes at the heart of our faith, and that is the resurrection of Christ. Paul writes in his letters to the Corinthians that if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. Our message of the gospel is all but a lie. It is useless. But is there evidence for the resurrection? Today's episode, we're going to speak with Dr. Michael Licona. Welcome to Questions in the Desert. Thank you so much, Dr. Licona, for joining us on Questions in the Desert. Now, before we get started on the topic of the resurrection, why might it be important for a Christian to be equipped with at least some basic facts, some basic historical evidence when they share the gospel?
Well, when Jesus was on earth, he made some pretty radical claims. He claimed to be God's chosen servant to usher in God's kingdom. He claimed to be God's uniquely divine son. He claimed that he had authority to forgive sins, which was a prerogative that belonged to God. And he claimed pretty much that he was the only way to God. So when you make those kind of claims, your critics are going to ask for some evidence, some proof. I mean, we would do that today. They did that back then. And Jesus said he would provide one proof, his resurrection. So if Christ was not raised, then that makes him a false prophet and a failed Messiah, and we shouldn't be Christians. It'd be worthless. It'd be like purchasing or holding on to stock of a bankrupt company. It would be worthless. So, but if Jesus did rise from the dead, then it would seem that he did so in confirmation of his claims, and that Christianity is true, and it's something we need to think about.
What would you say to the claim if somebody just said, well, historically there's, even just with the Jewish people, there's been several, claimed messiahs. Why this particular Jesus of Nazareth?
Well, those messiahs just, they were all failed messiahs. I think that most Jews today would say that none of those figures were actual messiahs. But when it comes to Jesus, he provided a proof. He said, I'll give you one sign that I am who I claim to be, and it's his resurrection. So if Jesus rose from the dead, it would appear that Christianity is true and that he was who he claimed to be.
That makes sense. If they weren't successful, then that kind of excludes them. Our world history is just full of historical figures. We've got, people like Cleopatra, Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, various Roman emperors come out in movies, Augustus, Nero. For anybody that might not think that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ was a real historical figure, a real person in our history, what might you say about that?
Well, I mean, that's just a fringe position. It's not really held by more than a handful of scholars in the relevant fields. In fact, I think Richard Carrier is perhaps the leading figure who's proposing that Jesus never existed. And by his own count, when he included himself a few years ago, he only knew of 7 scholars, including himself, in irrelevant fields who held that position. So it is a radical fringe position. And in fact, I would say that there are more, at least as many, if not more, credentialed historians who deny the Holocaust as there are who deny the existence of Jesus. Now, because it's a fringe position doesn't mean it's wrong, okay? The evidence that we would have, though, has compelled a nearly universal heterogeneous consensus of scholars in the relevant fields today, historians of Jesus. And we'd have things like you've got multiple independent sources, eyewitness sources, sources that are rooted in eyewitness testimony, unsympathetic, even hostile sources that mention Jesus. I think I probably mentioned multiple independent sources. So you have this, and in many different sources that do mention Jesus. It's hard to you've got Paul in First Corinthians and in Galatians who mentions that he saw James, the brother of Jesus. So if Jesus was a mythical character, then what does that say about his brother? Was he likewise mythical, or did James and others lie about a person named Jesus who never actually existed, but it had existed within the lifetime? And when Paul is coming against Christianity, it's because he knows something about it. He's able to say what the Christians are proclaiming is something that's contrary to what he already believed to be true. And so he was attacking Christianity. Well, Jesus was a contemporary of Paul. So, Paul would have known about Jesus. Paul would have been in Jerusalem on many occasions when Jesus would have been there. In fact, Paul, as a Pharisee, he might have even been at the trial, someone who had been at the trial as a witness. He might have been a witness of Jesus' crucifixion. We don't know this, but he would have certainly been in Jerusalem at the very time Jesus is alleged to have been crucified. That Josephus, a Jewish non-Christian historian, mentions Jesus' crucifixion. Tacitus, who is a hostile source, a Roman historian, mentions Jesus' execution by the Romans, by Pontius Pilate. Some might say that Tacitus got this information from the Christians, but if Tacitus is hostile to Christianity, why would he be consulting Christian sources and regarding them as credible sources? I mean, we just go on and on about these things, but the evidence is extremely good that Jesus existed, and the arguments that attempt to discredit such evidence has not at all been found to be persuasive or compelling by professional historians or scholars.
I was wondering, would you be able to talk about some of the common things that generally all historians believe about the person of Jesus Christ?
Sure. Well, I'd say virtually every scholar who studies the subject, every scholar in a relevant field, and I mentioned like uh, New Testament scholars, historians of Jesus, professional historians, general historians, they would agree that Jesus lived in the first century, the first half of the first century, that he lived in Judea, that he was a Jewish itinerant speaker um, who had claimed that God had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. That is not to say that they were divine miracles and exorcisms, but these folks will say that the evidence suggests that he did perform deeds that were regarded by many as divine miracles and exorcisms. They also agree that Jesus taught in parables, that he was crucified on the instigation of the Jewish leadership by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and that shortly thereafter, a number of his followers claimed to have experienced appearances of the risen Jesus to them. They also agree that an enemy of the church named Paul likewise converted to Christianity when he had an experience he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him. You'd be hard pressed to find any scholars who deny these things. You will find one on occasion, like for example, Bart Ehrman denies that Jesus was known as a miracle worker during his life, but he acknowledges that he is in the minority there. And in fact, I've talked to experts on the miracles of Jesus, historians of Jesus, who focused on that, and they've told me that they don't know of any other scholars who would say such a thing. So, you've got virtually 100% of scholars in the relevant fields who grant these things, a heterogeneous consensus. So we're talking agnostic, atheist, liberal, moderate, conservative, Christian. And it's not correct because scholars grant it. I don't want to give that impression. But the reason this is important is because when you're talking about a heterogeneous consensus of scholars, so you're including people who have vastly different worldviews here, who wouldn't think Jesus was in any sense the Messiah or divine, or that he rose or performed any kind of miracles. Even these grant that seems to suggest that the evidence for these things is quite good.
Well, Jesus appeared to 500 people in the book of Acts, and that is one of the more miraculous things in the New Testament, apart from the resurrection. Um, what would be a good, or what's something that you could help somebody to defend that position, that was actually something that's an historical event?
Well, some things are better attested than others, of course. So the appearance to Peter would be, better attested because it's mentioned in the oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. It's also mentioned by um, Luke. Luke in chapter 24, where it mentions that he appeared to Simon. So you've got that. You've got the group appearances that are multiply attested. The appearance to the more than 500 at one time is only attested in that oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. And had it appeared in, let's say, the Gospel of John, then scholars would say, well, this is late, it's not reported in anything else, and so it's probably not historical. But that's not at all what we have. We've got oral tradition that's probably the earliest report of Jesus's resurrection appearances, and they're occurring in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, this oral tradition. And it's Paul says that he delivered to them probably in the year 51 when he established the church at Corinth. He delivered to them at that time what he had also received, which would have been beforehand. So, I mean, we're talking about tradition that is 20 years old at the very latest, 20 years old, and is at the time he imparts it or receives it, and that it comes from witnesses he deemed to be credible, which, in my opinion, that would be no one else other than the Jerusalem apostles. So this is very early. So you might accuse Paul or, excuse me, the apostles of lying or inventing this, which I don't think would hold, but that's about the only thing you could do because it's not late and it derives from the alleged eyewitnesses. So it's nothing that you can just, brush off quickly, because it is so early and probably goes back to the Jerusalem apostles.
Yeah. So I mean, what would be the consequences of just somebody claiming to even be talking about this resurrected Christ in the climate of Jerusalem at the time specifically?
Yeah. Well, I would guess just a lot of people would have thought that they were insane, right?
Hmm.
Or lying in order to keep the Jesus movement going. But I don't think um, it would have been hard to keep the movement going if Jesus had not actually risen from the dead, because that would require that these guys were either lying or hallucinating. Lying, um, I really don't know of many scholars today who would even suggest that this is a possibility, that they were lying about it. Because the data that we have suggests that these disciples were willing to suffer continuously and willing to die for their gospel proclamation that Jesus had been raised. You've got people like Luke, Tertullian, John. You've got Dionysius of Corinth, Origen, Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement of Rome, just to name some of the earlier ones. And, they mention how the disciples did suffer, and some of them actually did endure martyrdom. Several of them endured martyrdom, at least. Now, maybe they all did, but some of those reports of the other disciples who were martyred would have been late, and they might be true, they may not be true. But we would know at least about the martyrdom of Peter, James, the brother of Jesus. Those would be secure, and Paul, those would be secure, that they died as martyrs. But all the evidence we have would also suggest that the others did suffer continuously and were willing to die for their beliefs. And this suggests that they sincerely believed what they were proclaiming is true. And that included the resurrection of Jesus. So it's hard to say that they were lying. Hallucinations is the most popular alternative explanation today, but that also has problems, serious problems.
Yes, thank you for that. I was wondering, Dr. Licona, when in your own walk with your faith, when you became a Christian, how How did evidence play a part in your faith, and did you ever struggle with that?
Well, evidence played no part in my becoming a Christian. I became a Christian at the age of 10, and it was the first time I heard the gospel. And I know that I'd been seeking, I'd been wanting to know how to get to heaven. And I remember asking my mom, and she really just didn't know. But or the answers she gave me were not satisfying. But this guy came in, and I heard the gospel for the first time at church, and it's like, wow, this is what I've been looking for. It was a Presbyterian church. They gave an invitation, which is weird for Presbyterian church, and I thought this is exactly what I've been looking for. And I went forward, and it was that day that I gave my life over to Christ. But that was at age 10, and of course, it's not like you're really thinking through all the objections or anything. It sounded good to me. It's what I was looking for. And I made a decision to follow Christ that day. But later on, when I was in grad school, finishing up grad school, my last semester, I began questioning whether Christianity is true. I was in my early to mid 20s at that point, and I was, considering going into full-time Christian ministry. And I'd never questioned my faith, but I started to, and I started thinking, well, what if this isn't true after all? That I'm devoting my life to a fairy tale, and I didn't want to do that. And so that's what motivated me to consider if there was evidence to support the truth of Christianity.
Yeah, how does that play right there a part in your ministry when you're speaking to, like, say, college
Yeah,
students?
a lot
Do
of
you?
college students are having the same sort of experience. The only thing is a lot of them are having professors who have the objective of deconverting them. They want them to give up their Christian faith. And so they make it their objective, and they focus on doing that during the class. I mean, we saw this, of course, in the fictional movie God Is Not Dead, but I've had students from all over the US tell me that that happens in their classes. It actually does happen, where the professor comes in on the first day of class and says, how many of you are Christians? And a few raise their hand, and he says, or she says, that their objective is that by the end of the semester, they will no longer be Christians. So that is happening. Of course, they don't say how many of you are Muslims or how many of you are Islam, or I'm sorry, Hindus or Buddhists. They just focus on Christians there. And if you had a Christian professor say, how many of you are not Christians, or how many of you are atheists or agnostics? My goal is by the end of the semester to convince you to become a Christian, to convince you that Christianity is true. That professor would be out on their ear. And even if they had tenure, well, the school would make it very difficult for them. So um, there is this that's going on, an attack on Christian students. Moreover, you have had a number of states that have, like California and some others, that have said, if they've told Christian campus ministries, unless you allow LGBTQ and atheists to serve on your leadership committees, we're not talking about just attending the meetings. They have to be able to serve on their leadership committees. If they're not allowed to do that, then they tell the campus ministry that they are not welcome on campus. And there have been several who have been ousted from their campuses as a result. And fortunately, President Trump has helped to reverse that. I know Ratio Christi has sued some of the campuses from which they have been ousted. And because of the conservative federal judges that President Trump has appointed, they've had rulings in their favor for their First Amendment freedom of speech. But these attacks are really happening. The students on college campuses are experiencing these things. And of course, the peer pressure is immense, because it's not only the professors, it's fellow students from whom they feel pressure as well.
Like, how important is it that scholars, biblical scholars, are supporting the evidences like the resurrection, on the playing field, where where people are seeing these scholars, that they are on par with, that These scholars can be accredited scholars, and it's not such a dumb idea to believe that Jesus was alive, he was a real person, and that he resurrected, from an historical point of view.
Now, I think it's very important for people to see that credentialed scholars who are providing good arguments to show that Jesus did exist, that that we can verify historically numerous items in his life. I think we can verify that he rose from the dead. And even for those who would say that, well, you can't verify that, they have to at least admit that we've got some pretty good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. It's not just something that's got to be accepted purely on faith. I mean, there's some good historical evidence for it.
Yeah. Lastly, could you give some pointers, I guess, to anybody that would want to become a biblical scholar? What would the road be in front of them? What would that be like?
Well, first thing they need to do would be to get a master's degree. If they've already got a bachelor's degree, if you don't have a bachelor's degree in biblical studies or theology, something like that, then you're going to have to do some undergraduate work. And if you're saying a biblical scholar, usually you're choosing theology, or you're choosing Old Testament, or you're choosing New Testament. Those are the three main disciplines of New Testament scholarship: Old Testament, New Testament, or theology. So you decide what you want to do. If you don't have a bachelor's degree in that, you're probably going to have to take some undergrad courses before you get accepted into a master's degree into one of those fields. And once you do that, then you go for a PhD in the field in which you got your master's degree, Old Testament, New Testament, or theology. And, you end up publishing. You publish in peer-reviewed journal articles. You publish some academic works. That's when you're considered to be a scholar in that field. So you got to learn the language. So if you're doing New Testament, you learn Greek. If you're doing Old Testament, you learn Hebrew. If you're doing theology, you're still going to have to know a little bit of each of those languages, but not a ton. So yeah, those are the steps you'd have to take. And it takes some years, but it's hard work, but it's fun. Once you're studying, once you get into grad school, things get a little different, quite a bit different than they are in your undergrad. I have to admit, I didn't really enjoy most of my undergraduate studies, because you're just studying so many broad, different topics. And for me, that just wasn't fun. I wasn't interested. But once I got into the master's program and I could study something for which I was passionate about, and depends what program you're getting into. If you're going for a PhD, if you're thinking scholarship, then you do a Master of Arts. If you're thinking of becoming a pastor or more practical in the ministry, then you do a Master of Divinity. But yeah, if you're doing a Master of Arts, an MA degree in whatever field it is, most of your courses are going to be stuff in which you're really interested. And then with your doctoral studies, almost all of that is going to be focused on areas in which you have a great interest. So even though it becomes more demanding, more rigorous, as you go up high into more difficult degrees, it becomes more fun, and that compensates for a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Licona. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jake. God bless you and your viewers.
God bless you.
For more information on Dr. Michael Licona, visit him at risenjesus.com. And of course, thank you for watching Questions in the Desert.